Okay, our next speaker is Andy King, Curator of Industrial and Maritime History at the Museum of Bristol. Over to you, Andy.
Thank you. You can see my job title gets longer the longer I am at Bristol, so there you go. When I arrived in Bristol to work for the museum 30 years ago now, wrong button. Bingo. One of the first things I was asked to do was to lead the restoration of a steam tug that we'd just purchased for the museum. This was an utterly daunting prospect for me, as I had no apparent resources with which to achieve it. The ship was moored outside the old industrial museum, what's now M Shed, where I work, which was staffed at the time by 4 day-to-day front-of-house staff and 1 conservation technician, apart from me. So very apparent we weren't going to be able to do this. In addition, we did have a very small volunteer team that ran the little steam railway that we run, but they were committed to that and nothing else. It seemed clear that the only way to make any progress was going to be through the enlistment of some volunteers, something that at that time I'd never been involved with. We were lucky enough over the next few years to get the right people appear at the right time, and we achieved Mayflower's restoration in about 6 years, and we've since gone on to restore another 2 vessels, 2 railway locomotives, several wagons that go with those, of course, the scheduled ancient monument steam crane we use down here, and so far 2.5 out of the 4 electric cranes that we have outside our building. This one being seen lifting some of our architectural collections out of the building to be taken to another store. We now have a team of about somewhere between 75 and 100, it goes up and down a lot, people working particularly on the industrial and maritime collections, and between them they contributed about 30,000 hours last year. In addition to restoring and maintaining all of these things, they also operate them in a regular programme for the general public. We have a series of volunteers who run tours of our stores at the museum on 4 days a week. They also carry out digitising and cataloguing roles, and they almost completely administer the museum's oral history collections. There are also lots of other volunteers across the rest of Bristol's museum service. I wondered how this has happened. It seems to sort of 30 years goes by just like that, but when we first started doing it, it wasn't something that met with a great deal of approval. So I started to think about the reasons why it has been so successful, and perhaps this has to do with the sort of morals and ethics of with which you approach your volunteers. First of all, be willing, or at least accept being placed in a position where there is no alternative to having volunteers, which in effect is what happened to me. When we first embarked on this course, as I mentioned, there was much opposition from the trades unions and from other staff, who understandably, I think, felt that their jobs and professional standards were being put at risk. There remains an element of this even now, and I'd be the first to recommend that you try and establish clear boundaries between what the staff are employed to do and what volunteers are able to be doing or should be doing. It's increasingly difficult to draw that line, however. I'm sure you all know that. Secondly, believe in serendipity. Throughout the 30 years I've been doing this, the right person has always seemed to turn up at the right time. The electric cranes are a great example. They'd stood outside the building, they were there when we moved in. We'd done nothing to them until 2000, when all of a sudden we had an avalanche, it seemed, of newly retired electrical engineers who knew exactly what all the gubbins in those cranes was all about and were able to take them on. In the early years, I think trying to find the right person at the right time was very much linked to the specific project that we were working on, but later on, I think we've tended to sort of respond when people appear, and I'll talk about that a bit more. Recruitment. for about the first 10 to 15 years, we had that wonderful thing, the job creation schemes in all its different names, manpower services. Through these, it was quite often possible to find nearly the right person for a job and to retain them for a while with a small pittance being paid to them. But we lost them. If they were any good, they moved on to another job. They were only there for a short time anyway. Quite a lot of them were quite young, and it would be great to keep those people on as volunteers, but young people have better things to do with their time than spend all their hours at the museum, I think. So in the early years, our demographic of the volunteer and quasi-volunteer workforce was a lot younger than it is now. Since then, we've made a huge amount of use of volunteer bureaus, and I think that partly accounts for the number of people that we have working for us now. Take anyone. I think we ought to be open to anyone who feels that they would like to come and volunteer for museums. An informal interview will often, without necessarily putting them off, it may well single out those people who suddenly realise that what they expected from a museum volunteering job isn't quite what you're offering. And it gives them a chance to back away then with some dignity, if they choose to. However, I've had quite a few unpromising individuals who turned out eventually to be complete stars in the team that we run. This brings me on to knowing why they're coming. There are loads of reasons for volunteering, not necessarily just coming to do the task that they're involved with. Some just like the companionship. I mean, at the moment, we have quite a large number of widowed, bachelor and separated men, largely, who are used to making relationships at work. They've retired or newly retired. They find it difficult to make relationships outside a work environment. Coming to work at the museum is great for them. It works really well. Maintaining standards. I don't mean just professional and ethical things. And I'm only halfway through and there's my red light. I'll stop.
Okay, Andy, thank you very much.
Oh, my last thing I should say, just to go right on to the end, is would you do it again? Yes, definitely.
Okay. Thank you.
Rachel, would you care to respond?
I'm going to respond to sort of points raised by all three of the last speakers. Everybody seems to have emphasised, in fact, particularly the first two speakers, how the trainer's responsible if there is a mistake. And on one sense, that seems fine, but then that seems to remove any personal responsibility from the volunteers themselves. And then you end up patronising them because you're saying you don't have any responsibility, I'll take, if you make a mistake, it's my fault. And I'm a bit concerned about that. I don't know if anybody else thinks about that in particular. Just moving on to, say, a volunteer-run museum, there'll be a trust and a group of trustees who have a number of legal responsibilities. So if they're capable of taking on that responsibility, there's no reason they shouldn't be able to take on other responsibilities with suitable training. Andy, you actually said it's difficult to draw the line sometimes between the volunteer and the professional. So I'm just wondering a bit more about, if that's the case, how do you do that? Because you do need to be able to do that, I think.
In our case, it's going to get increasingly difficult. One of the things I was going to say, had I had time, we've just been awarded $150,000 by the Paul Hamlin Foundation to integrate MSHED in particular, but the whole museum service in Bristol, much more closely with the community. And 1/3 of the three prongs that we're choosing to work hard on is integrating the volunteer force very, very much more in the running of the museum, such that we will expect them to make decisions. And there are obviously lots and lots of issues around that, but it's an exciting and potentially dangerous path down which to go. And I suspect we're all of us going to be faced with going much more in that direction. And that's a good thing, I think. Museums are there for the benefit of the public who pay for them one way or another. So it is only right that we should seek to make the running of those museums and the involvement that people can have with the museums as democratic as we possibly can. And it'll involve a complete mind shift, I think, on my part, at the very least, to try and achieve that. It's a really, really difficult thing to do when you've been trained professionally to do a particular thing, and all of a sudden you're finding that you're being expected to bring in, through a completely different route, lots of different people. It's going to be an interesting one.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. I think there's the real thing that's really kind of bothering me slightly about this is the issue of accountability. Ethics is one framework by which we assess accountability and measure accountability. And what I'm still not hearing, it all sounds absolutely fantastic, all these volunteers doing all this fantastic work, but at which point do they take accountability for the work that they're doing, and how is that accountability implemented? Because, again, if we have a professional framework and we have a professional organisation, that offers accountability at some stage, and it just seems to worry me slightly that question hasn't been answered. Seems to be a particularly, everyone's saying it's a good thing, we have to do it, but I'm not clear as to how we can do it. We have a response there.
Jackie Reddy, Winchester Museum. I'd just like to say, do you have contracts with all your volunteers?
No.
Okay. No, it's just we don't either, and it's just a quite contentious thing that if they did have a contract, with that accountability be written in there somewhere, and is it the way to go?
Interesting. One more here then.
Sorry, David Woody, the Tank Museum. We do have contracts. We have, just like you would with an employee, any volunteer has a contract. So again, some of those things can be written down, which I'd like to think perhaps addresses some of the accountability. The point I was just going to perhaps mention is that I do think this is a way that so many museums are going to have to go in the future. And the one other point I'd say is ethics and the conservation is only a small part of the issue about volunteers. It's about lots of other issues, such as, and again, we had to learn all the different language, pro-social modelling for young people, social engagement, middle-aged men wanting where do they go and bond again, apart from if they can go and relive it in workshops, etc. And these are all very important things. So what gets me is the money is only going to arrive with those issues. It is not going to arrive about the actual conservation, certainly from people like the Lottery Fund. And that, to me, is one of those issues I think we've all got to take on board, that if we're going to go to people like the Lottery, which will be the main funding body, I think, for most of our conservation, the bolt-on, it won't be a bolt-on, it'll be integral, is the involvement of volunteers in that process, whether that's in conservation or doing lots of other things as well. And just my own example was that, very quickly, is when we started talking about conserving tanks to the Lottery, the Lottery board, quite understandably, their faces glazed over. The minute that we said that we use young offenders on probation hours to help restore the tank, suddenly they woke up and we were the bee's knees sort of thing. So I think that's another thing. The overall politics, one's all got to take this on board as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Katie, would you wish to make a point?
I'm interested about this question about boundaries, because I think it kind of goes back to the point, Jane, that you were making about how conservators, part of their professional responsibility is to be facilitators of access and not to create boundaries around things. And I wonder if it's more to do with the skills that we have to expect that professional conservators or any people working on collections in a conservation capacity and are paid to do it may have to be expected to bring with them, which are those skills of working with other people and achieving their conservation aims through it. So their ability to lead, mentor, supervise, train, manage, and all that will be and are as important as the technical skills about choosing whatever the right glue or paint or whatever it is to do something with.
Indeed, but it seems to me that if this is the way to go, and I'm yet to be convinced that in 5 years' time this will be the issue it is now, because we'll have forgotten what the big society was quite quickly, any code of conduct or code of ethics that's going to be developed for professionals has got to deal with this. It's got to show within that code of conduct and within that code of ethics how it's going to be dealt with, because at the moment it's complete void. If you look at ECHO codes of ethics or any of the other existing codes of ethics, they talk about intangibility, they talk about place, significance, but there's absolutely nothing about the specifics. It talks about society in the broadest senses, but it doesn't deal with this very specific issue. Jane.
I just want to ask if you have to be paid to be a professional, because it strikes me that the nature of your contract of employment is something, as a trade unionist, about which I have very strong opinions.
Okay.
I don't think it's anything to do with ICON or other code of ethics.
Yeah.
I think our code of ethics is about how we practice conservation. And how we practice conservation goes back to issues about deciding the significance, the documentation, all those other issues. And if someone is practicing conservation, then they're either practicing it ethically or they're not. And it's not whether or not they're getting paid that defines that.
Okay. Thank you. So we need to finish the session there. Sorry, last point, Hazel.
Yes, Hazel Newey. So one thing I would take up about volunteers is that I worked in an institution where the range of objects was so great and we didn't have much in-house knowledge about a lot of them. I thought Andy might have picked this up with the technical side. And actually, a lot of knowledge and skills will reside within those volunteers. And we do have, I think, as conservators, a duty to try and help maintain some of the knowledge and skills that these people have. You can argue it's a curatorial thing, but often we're more interested in the practical preservation of the object.
Okay.
So I'd like to raise that as well.
Okay, thank you very much. So we need to finish the session there. I'd just like to thank all of the speakers this afternoon for their contributions. So I'm now going to